Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and welcome to the St Andrews Book Festival. My name is Hugo Rifkind. I'm a writer for The Times and a presenter on Times Radio, and I'm your interviewer. I said this morning, it's the afternoon, isn't it? This afternoon. I'm your interviewer this afternoon. Being an interviewer is a position that can cause certain angst. To explain that angst, I want you to imagine if you were a portrait painter, jobbing portrait painter, worked pretty well, it's all going okay, but one morning you turn up and you're told, these are the two people whose portraits you're going to be painting today, and they're both Leonardo da Vinci, right? That's kind of the experience I've got now. This is how the next hour is going to be. To introduce the panel, although I'm sure that's not necessary, Gavin Esler was born in Glasgow, but moved to Edinburgh, which I feel was a good move. He was educated first at Duddingston Primary, where I used to go skateboarding, and then George Heriot's. He attended the universities of Kent and Leeds, and then began work as a journalist in Belfast, and before long he joined the BBC in Belfast, also in Washington, and then many other places before winding up at the role for which he's perhaps best known at Newsnight from 2003. He's the author of roughly 1 million books, including 5 novels, but also numerous works of non-fiction, the most recent of which is Britain is Better Than This, that we're going to discuss a little bit today. Jim Naughtie, whose secret first name I learn is Alexander, like a certain former Prime Minister, was brought up in Aberdeenshire. He attended Keith Grammar and then the universities of Aberdeen and Syracuse, New York, and he worked for the Press and Journal, the Scotsman, the Washington Post, and the Guardian, before moving to the BBC, where it would appear he finally managed to hold down a job. Among a multitude of roles, he is probably best known as a presenter on Radio 4's The Today programme, which he joined in 1994, where he would stay for more than 2 decades. He too has written an entire bookcase comprising fiction and non-fiction alike, but his most recent is A Spy Across the Water, which we shall come to very shortly. Guys, was that okay?
Well, I could suggest a couple of things, but anyway, never mind, that's fine. Yeah.
Look, I'll leave it to Leonardo to comment.
Yeah.
Gavin, I'm going to let's talk the books for a bit first before we branch onto the wider world. And Gavin, I want to ask you about yours first. Your book is, you're right, it's basically an answer to a question that was asked of you by a member of the public, which was, why are things so shit? Right?
That's correct, yes.
Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, it was at Dartington Hall, which is one of those wonderful places in our country. I was there at a book festival talking about a previous book, and I was sitting outside in the sunshine going through my notes. I'd been for a walk. There were trout in the River Dart. There were red deer in the forest, or deer in the forest. I thought, this is a great country. This is a really great country. And I just happened to come across the news that the United Kingdom has more Nobel Prize winners in one university, Cambridge, than any country in the world except the United States and Britain itself. So I'm thinking, this is not bad, really. And then this elderly lady, very, very well turned out, with a cut glass accent rather like Her Majesty the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II. She came up to me and she said, do you mind if I ask you a question? And I said, no, certainly not. She said, why are things so shit? Just like that. And I thought, that's the next book. Because I'm living in this world where things are actually wonderful on one side, it appears to be, but nothing seems to work. You know, the public transport doesn't seem to work, the NHS has got its problems. We know all these things. And it was made even more obvious in this year of elections. We've had elections around the world, but they do not equate necessarily to democracy. You know, there was a shock victory for Vladimir Putin in Russia, the shock being he got 88% of the vote. I mean, who are the other 12%? Or Paul Kagame in Rwanda, who got 99% of the vote, which is a big improvement on the 93% he got earlier. So if he lasts another 7 years, he'll get 104%. You know, we have got our own problems, which we'll get onto, and that's what the book was about. Why is this brilliant country that we live in, wonderful spaces like this, great people, we actually trust each other more than people in other OECD countries. So if I drop my wallet, you'd probably pick it up, I'd probably get it back, and I mean that. Whereas we don't trust our government nearly as much as in some other countries, although given the events in the United States, perhaps that also is changing. We have so many great advantages, and yet why is it we have essentially a failed political system? And that's what the book's about.
Well, look, we're going to come back to all of that and more very shortly. Jim, your book is a novel, The Spy Across the Water. It's the third in a series, not quite a trilogy, but it's certainly a series about, and this one is about what might have been going on sort of quietly in the background in the UK and also in Washington shortly before Britain and the IRA started negotiating in the 1980s.
Indeed.
Why this period?
I should preface this by saying I never use bad language in public, so I'm not going to go down Gavin's road.
It's a quote, it's
Although
fine. Ofcom will allow it once.
It's a quote, it wasn't me.
Just back from the United States, I feel like it. But anyway, this book, as Hugo says, it's, I suppose to use the shorthand, a spy thriller, which is set in the 80s. And it was a very curious time because various things were happening. We were starting to get information out of Moscow through secret channels. The government was that, thanks to Mr. Gordievsky, that things might be beginning to crumble in quite a serious way. And at the same time, our hero in this book is posted, having spent his life in MI6, I mean, the previous 16 years, he was posted to Washington as ambassador. And he came across an old colleague and contact that he had known who was in the IRA and had operated effectively as a double agent for the British in Northern Ireland, the British state, as it were, in the 70s. And so he gets involved in a great kerfuffle with this man whose life he wants to protect, although they are both, of course, aware that they are and always will be on different sides of the conflict. Fleming, the man in question, believes that, Britain had to fight the IRA in any way that it could, bring this whole thing to an end, but in a just way. And his old comrade, in a sense, behind the lines, was a devoted Irish nationalist who believed that the armed struggle, as it would have been called on his side, was justified. But nonetheless, they had trust. And so what the book is actually about is about how politics can be managed by people who care about coming to the right conclusion, even though they are hamstrung by all kinds of impediments. In this case, Fleming's predicament as a loyal member of the Secret Service, to live a life which obliges him to keep the most important, the most fulfilling, and perhaps the most personally satisfying things he ever does in his life from everybody, including his family, which is a rather strange position to be in. And so it's a story, I hope a kind of adventure story, but it's essentially about people who have a sense of public duty, which is the kind of thing that has interested all of us in our careers, but also have private loyalties and private obligations, which they feel very strongly, and it's resolving these against a background of violence and against a background of a political process that seems to be getting out of control, that gives you a story. You begin with a line and then you just write a story. You know this. I mean, you don't write the last line first. You just write a line. Le Carre used to say, somebody said, well, what's the story? And he said, if you just start at the beginning and you do it. And he said, the cat sat on the mat. That's not really a story. He said, the cat sat on the dog's mat. You've got a story and you're away. So anyway, that's the impulse.
And well, look, to draw these sort of two themes together as much as we can.
Good luck with that.
Oh, no, I've given this a lot of thought, really. Let's start, Jim, first up, this period, the 80s, was it a more worrying and fragile period than now, or less so?
In retrospect, much less so. I don't think anybody realized how quickly the end of the Cold War would come, and you were involved in this deeply, Gavin. I mean, I was in newspapers at the time, but I mean, when things began to move with Gorbachev, I mean, I remember going to Moscow in Mrs. Thatcher's train, as it were, to, not literally, but, to watch her meeting with Gorbachev in '86, this relationship, which really was remarkable. and was the beginning of the end. I remember watching Gorby in Washington doing walkabouts where, you know, Reagan feted him. But it's still, we didn't believe it would happen in 2 or 3 years. The head of MI6 said the other day, this week, that he'd never known, I mean, he's not an old man, in the early 50s, but he had never known a time when the world was scarier than it is now. And I think it's infinitely scarier now than it was in the mid-80s. I was just somewhere yesterday where someone with reason to know said, look, if you look and you try to work out how scary it is, just think of this. In 1 2-week period in early November, Putin held a kind of meeting in Kazan in central Russia. The president of South Africa and the prime minister of India decided to forego the Commonwealth Heads of Government Summit and the king and all the rest of it, and instead go to pay obeisance to Putin and essentially kiss his hand. The Secretary General of the United Nations, which has supervision over the International Court, which had just indicted Putin for being a war criminal, went to Kazan to pay obeisance to Putin. The same week, North Korean troops arrived to fight a war on Russia's behalf in Europe. And the following week, Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. Now, you know, that's a concatenation of circumstances that beat anything that happened during the freeze of the Cold War. And these books were all set in a sort of Cold War thing, these spy ones. In a sense, what they're all about is the efforts of all these people, including Fleming and his colleagues, not to win the Cold War by some great, you know, coup d'etat, or coup de théâtre, really, on the battlefield. Coup de foudre, I think I meant, but you know what I mean. Anyway, but actually just to keep things in balance so that nothing happened. It was holding the line. And we're out of that now because everything's out of control. And so if you look at this book, which has as one of its central themes, I won't give it all away, but Gordievsky, our man in Moscow, was essentially rumbled because the Americans desperately wanted to know why we were getting better information from Moscow than they were. He was so secret. I mean, Mrs. Thatcher didn't know his name until he escaped in 1985 to flee for his life from Moscow. But it was gold dust, and it was her passport to influence in the Oval Office. But the Americans wanted to find out who this guy was, so they worked it out. But what they didn't know was they had a Russian double agent in the CIA called Ulrich James who gave the name to Moscow, and he had to flee for his life. So that's a kind of real background to the story, but it's essentially about people trying to keep the show on the road.
Gavin, when you wrote your book, Britain very much seemed to be on a trajectory into the same sort of chaos that we see spreading across the world at the moment. Do you think it is still on, without to make too overly a political point, do you think it's still on that trajectory? Or are we actually doing something perhaps slightly different? Or is it just a bump in the road?
We are doing things slightly differently, but I think there's two things going on. One is Mrs. Thatcher, at the end of her career, I had an opportunity to have a sit-down conversation with her in the United States. And I said to her, what scares you about the future? And she said, blockism. And I said, I don't know what you mean. And she said that the world's going to divide into 3 blocks, one based on the dollar, one based on the Chinese currency, and one based on the European currency. And what she didn't say is we'd be outside all of those. So that was something that she thought of then. And one of the things that I like about meeting political leaders is I like the ones who are interested in solving problems rather than creating them, rather than distracting, rather than saying, look over there, there's people coming ashore in Kent, when we can't actually get trains to run in Kent. I know, because I live in Kent. And we've been practicing the politics of distraction for quite a while, unfortunately. And one of those distractions is about this year of democracies that I talked about. Our own democracy is really in very great difficulty. I was at a meeting of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Monday to talk about how we should change our system. And there are 3 things that people generally agreed on. One is to change the voting system. Not everybody agrees on it, but the people in the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Fair Elections do. One is to get rid of dirty money and all the strange money that's coming in, because we could be Elonized just as America has done. We could, would you like to win £1 million by registering in a particular way?
Yeah.
And the third thing is misinformation and disinformation. And we are in all of those. And the one fundamental point that people kept mentioning was that 40% of us who could have voted in the last election, not the people here, I suspect, but 40% of us who could have voted didn't vote. Another 7% who couldn't vote because they could not vote because they were not registered. That means 53% of us voted, and Labour got a third of the votes. That's about 18% of us. So if that was true of a school, 18% turned up, we'd be rather worried about the education system. And we have been so complacent, particularly in England, I have to say, about, there's nothing perfect about Scotland's democracy or Northern Ireland's democracy or Welsh democracy, as we well know, and that's a subject for another debate. But at least you kind of get people who tend to represent you. And it's come through I was surprised in the many conversations with the politicians that were there on Monday night, how many of them get it. And they get it because they know, in the case of one that I was talking to, his majority would be immediately wiped out if there was a coalition, he was a Labour MP in this case, between Reform and the Conservatives. And it would still be a government supported by the minority of the people. So we have a chance to change things. We have a chance to see problems. And they are there. And that's one of the things that Mrs. Thatcher tried to do. Whether you like her politics or not, she tried to solve problems from her perspective.
Of course, the point about blockism and 3 blocks and a European currency, a Chinese currency, for the sake of argument, and the dollar, that's one of the reasons that Charles Pole, her Foreign Affairs advisor throughout her time in Number 10, is absolutely convinced that she would never have voted for Brexit, despite her antipathy to much that was going on in Europe at the time. But
she got us a great deal.
But
let's be honest. I mean, a much better deal than other people.
Well, and she created, and I think it's one of the signal achievements of her administrations, she created the European single market and effectively brought the European, Eastern Europe, into Europe, and which people had thought wasn't possible. So, but let's not go back to ancient history. I mean, you talk about Musk-proofing this country, and if you look about, if you look at the American election, when I've just spent some time watching it unfold, there are 2 very striking things about it. One is that Trump has had a stunning victory. He controls the Senate. The House it's only going to be a Republican majority of 1 or 2, and it's extremely fragile. But he's got the Senate. It means that by the time he leaves office, 4 years' time, he will have absolutely pinned the Supreme Court to a conservative interpretation of the Constitution, which essentially means rolling back the federal government. So a fundamental change. And yet, he got 49.7% of the vote. I mean, they're still counting some military votes. And Harris got, about 1.5% less. It is not an overwhelming victory in the sense that the vast majority of American people, even among those who voted, said we're going to have Trump. It's a country that's absolutely split, and yet it has produced a result that will have fundamental consequences in the way America faces the rest of the world and internally.
Can I ask you, Jim, what do you think about the kind of genuflection of the American establishment towards Trump that happened, that it seemed to me started happening when it looked like he was going to win?
Well,
all these places where you'd expect there would be sometimes resistance, all these people you'd expect to at least remember that this was the man who encouraged his supporters to storm the parliament, just forgot it like that.
Indeed. I mean, why did he win? Gavin referred to Elon Musk, Mr. X, as it were, who, if he doesn't have a white cat that he sits stroking in the evenings, I'd be very surprised. Elon Musk spent, in the last month of the campaign, more than $140 million on social media campaign on the transgender question. So that I met a man in Virginia, grown-up Republican local county chairman, ex-military officer, had worked in the Pentagon, serious guy, good citizen, all the rest of it, strong Republican. He said to me, well, who wants a country where your 10-year-old child can go to school in the morning and come back as a girl? I said, well, I don't particularly, but I mean, what are you talking about? Oh, he said, that's it's happening all over the country. I mean, this is nuts. It's completely nuts. I mean, we can all have arguments about identification and pronouns and all the rest of it. It's the stuff of a good debate. But some of the ludicrous stuff that was being pushed around, and if you look at the way that young African-American men and young Latino men disproportionately found themselves drawn to Trump, not by overwhelming majorities or anything like that, but significant numbers of them who might have been expected not to be natural Trump supporters, frankly, for their own economic interest. Just wait till they see inflation in 6 months, thanks to the tariff policy, were drawn to him because of this kind of stuff. And if we get into elections, and Gavin alluded to this, where the kind of messaging is more important than everything else, than the nature of the argument, the real argument, then we're going to be in trouble. So if you look at the campaign, let's just do this in 1 minute. After the Biden decision, which was not his decision, but was a decision, which was long overdue. If he'd gone at the last midterms, Harris would be president of the United States, but that's another matter. It didn't happen. They had a very good United Convention. They ran an extremely good campaign. Harris never put a foot wrong. Huge crowds, amazing enthusiasm, raised much more money than Trump in the last 2 months of the campaign. On traditional grounds, they did everything right.
Absolutely.
And it didn't work because the campaign actually was happening on a different level. And we have not yet adapted to the fact that that is how elections are going to be run in the future, here as well as there.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, Gavin, I want to ask you, who do we blame for putting us on that level? Because you make a very good case in your book about, likening the extent to which, for example, Trump didn't accept the loss of the last election, and you can link that with Boris Johnson's prorogation of Parliament, this idea of riding roughshod over what have become established democratic norms that the right's become incredibly good at. Flip side there, you also have an awful lot of the American left who didn't accept Donald Trump's first election at all. We had long campaigns, which I'm happy to say I supported, but they still existed, campaigns to overturn the Brexit result. One could make an argument that actually the Ross in democracy starts, it starts on the center and it starts on the left before it starts on the right, because the center and the left don't trust the right.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's certainly truth in that. And one of the things I talk about in the book is what has changed, however, is I think we're mostly familiar with the idea of throwing a dead cat on the table. So you talk about something and I throw a dead cat metaphorically on the table and we end up talking about that. And Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, brilliant at it. But what has changed is, and I speak as someone who spent a year of my life on one lie, and the lie was I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. Sorry, I was in character.
You should explain
there.
this.
I was totally in character, I should say. And I think some people know that. One lie, and you know what? The president then, Clinton, at the end of his term, was more popular than he was at the very start of his 8 years, because he broadly was seen to do things for the economy and elsewhere. And now we get a deluge of strategic lying. Lies told not because they're a mistake, not because you're in a bit of a jam of sexual relations or something, but because this is the way your strategy wishes to go. And that's what we have with Donald Trump, and we have it here. And I've had Americans, and you'll have had it too, oh, don't take him literally. Words are what we have.
Well, I'm afraid, yeah.
Take him seriously, but not literally. And I do take him seriously, and I do take to go back to
now he can do what he wants to do. It looks like we should have been taking him literally as well all along.
Yeah, literally, and so. But to go back to the core of the question about pessimism for the future, imagine a country the size of the United States introducing tariffs, which will be paid for by American citizens, actually, if you think about it, and which may dislocate the economy further because what are they going to do for Walmart? Are they going to make it at home, give American wages to pay this? Imagine a country doing that and talking about essentially America first and isolationism and appeasing a European leader who has said, oh, I've just got one more territorial ambition in Europe. That is from 1930, the Americans introduced tariffs, and it was a disaster. It produced the Great Depression or made it even worse. So we're in a similar situation, which is why people in the Defense Department and elsewhere talk about a pre-war rather than a post-war Britain. And it is very, very concerning.
It's very scary stuff. And, trying to write, espionage stories, fictional stories, but with a realistic background. I mean, one of the books is set in Les Événements in Paris in 1968, and another at the moment of government kerfuffle in London in the mid-70s, and then this one, this last one that Hugo alluded to, in a period of great tension in 1984. But it was all about, as I said before, holding the line and keeping things. Now everything is unstable. If you look across Europe, Romania, where they're waiting for the second round of the elections to come, is on the cusp of going in an Orbanish Hungarian direction, i.e. pro-Putin. The German government is in a very, very fragile, difficult state. There may be a lurch to a more populist right solution there. Marine Le Pen could well become president of France before much longer. I mean, this is Putin's dream, obviously. I mean, his two great foreign policy triumphs until he made his, I think, horrendous strategic blunder in Ukraine was getting Brexit and getting the election of Trump in 2016 in 1 year. I mean, that was, from his point of view, whatever you think about Brexit, from his point of view, that's what he wanted, because it divides. And, you know, that is where we are. We're in an extremely divided world. And everyone in NATO will be rallying around and saying, well, let's see, we've dealt with Trump before, we can deal with him again. I was talking to a former NATO Secretary General yesterday, how's that? Who shall be nameless, but I mean, Scottish, basically.
Who could it be?
No, I mean, and there have been emissaries coming over from Washington to people here and talking to the government and saying, look, on the basis of how much money he wants European allies, including Britain, to put into NATO, because his big argument is we don't put in enough. He'll argue, I want X%. He'll actually settle for something less. In other words, it'll be a deal. But the real question is when you get to the talking about Ukraine, and Zelensky's already, you know, floating all these notions about how NATO would do it. If there is a division of Ukraine along some kind of battle line over the next year, the issue is, and there's no escape from this, how does NATO defend that line? What is required? You know, are we going to be in a Lebanon, or are we going to, you know, are we going to have NATO troops from the Baltic to the Black Sea? And, you know, the idea that Putin will just walk away from all this, I mean, he's staked everything on it, and it's all about the greater Russia. And the idea that we can just click our fingers and get out of this, particularly with Trump as president, it seems to me fanciful.
Yeah.
So it is about, you know, to go back to my characters in these books, they're all trying to hold the line, but at least they knew what the line was. Now they wouldn't know where they were turning.
There's a question I want to ask both of you in slightly different ways. Gavin, I'll ask you this first, which is, did something snap in you? Because you, your career was largely, you had obligations of impartiality through most of your career, certainly your broadcast career, certainly on Newsnight. And then it seemed, watching externally, after Brexit, something in you went, I'm not going to do this anymore, I'm going to do something else. And I want to know what sparked that. I mean, I know what sparked that, big politically, but how you felt about it, why you wanted to do it.
No,
is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely right. It was very simple. I was sitting one day and I thought, I'm listening to someone telling lies on television, and
I can't say that.
And I can't say this is lies, and I can't balance it. You can't, you know, if Trump was part of it, of course.
Will you tell us who it was?
No. Well, there's a list actually. I've got a long list. Trump was obviously one of them, but it was also true in British politics, and it was actually Trump's inauguration was very interesting. 2017 inauguration was very interesting for me because that was a day when. Because I'm a nerd. I listened to the official accounts that it was the best attended, you know, the biggest crowds and so on and so on. I could see with my own eyes this was not the case. That was the Marx Brothers joke, you know, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? I believed my own eyes. Not only did I believe my own eyes, I checked with the Washington Metro. They'd sold very few tickets, or they had very few people going. Now, Trump could have spun that brilliantly and said, my people are the heart and soul of America. They can't afford to come to Washington.
He couldn't bear the idea.
But he couldn't bear that. He had to be the best. And so the lying there was, unfortunately, was also something which I saw within the British establishment too, or particularly the British government of the time. And that's very difficult to take because you can't balance it unless you say, sorry, that's just simply not true.
Well,
Jim,
I sympathise with you.
You've not yet snapped.
Not yet snapped. You never know.
Snapping quietly.
There may be a snap to come. I remember that day, the inauguration of which Gavin speaks, in January 2017. And Trump made this awful speech. Well, I mean awful in the sense if you look at presidential inaugurals down the years, it's down there. it's down there in the lower quartile, I'd say. I'm not talking about its content, but I'm trying to get myself out of a hole that I'm busy digging myself. Anyway, I'll quote someone else.
Maybe he's going to snap live on stage.
He's snapping right now, I can tell.
A proper journalistic falling down moment.
Well, you know that since you used the word, I can use it. There was a book published, one of the first books of the Trump era, inside the White House kind of book, which quoted George W. Bush as saying to Hillary Clinton as they walked off the platform of Trump's inauguration, they were both there as guests, obviously, to go to lunch in the Capitol Rotunda. And W apparently turned to Hillary and said, and I'm using Gavin's word, he said, that was some weird shit. And I was interviewing Hillary Clinton a couple of years later at the Festival Hall with 3,000 screaming Hillary fans. And I decided not to raise this on the platform because I'm a decent, properly spoken person. Anyway, I got off the stage with her and I said, I just want to ask you, is this true? This book had just come out. Is that what he said to you? And she turned to me and said, deadpan, and she said, we were together behind the stage and nobody else. And she said, no, that's not what he said. So I said, oh, well, I'm very glad I didn't mention it. What did he say? And she said, he said, that's some effing weird shit. But anyway, but not go there. But my favorite, I was going home to New York a couple of days later via New York, and I was trying to get a ticket for Hamilton, which had just opened. And I couldn't in the end, but anyway. And I was anxious to see it. And, you know, he's this man who was effectively George Washington's prime minister, who wrote great chunks of the Constitution, you know, was the first, as it were, Chancellor of the Exchequer of the United States of America. Extraordinary, you know, son of a, you know, bastard son of a Scot in the Caribbean. Anyway, fabulous show, as you all know. Anyway, I was walking back with a friend from the Washington Post, and I said, do you know how I can get a ticket for Hamilton? He couldn't help, unfortunately, but anyway. And he said to me, we've just had the Trump inaugural. He said, you do know that the script for the Trump presidency is not going to be written by Alexander Hamilton. It's going to be written by Mario Puzo, author of The Good Fight. And I thought that was quite a good line.
That is quite a good line.
And I didn't say it, someone else said it, so there we are.
What do you think, Jim, of there's an argument that's often made that traditions of impartiality in broadcast, particularly in broadcast in this country, are increasingly sort of hacked by extremists. And there's a situation where you end up with obliged to deliver a fake balance between somebody saying something ludicrous
it's
and somebody
awkward.
saying something that isn't ludicrous.
Yeah, a fake argument, but you've got to have a nutter on if somebody, you know, all this. You know, whether it's left
Can
or
I explain
right.
we're not doing that now?
No,
just to clarify.
But I am strongly of the belief that the traditions which are upheld pretty well, you know, consistently by the BBC, by ITN, by Sky, are absolutely vital. Because if you look at the American broadcast media and what has happened, and it's not just Fox News, others on the other side, as it were, liberal side, if you like, CNN and NBC particularly, have decided that they've got to deal with this by going the other way. And the trouble is, you know as well as I do, you're too young, that, you know, Americans who remember the 70s, remember, you know, you watch CBS Evening News or ABC Evening News or NBC, and you know, Walter Cronkite and John Chancellor and Peter Jennings, and, you know, you were getting straight, old-fashioned, absolute, ironclad journalism. You know, you might like one guy more than the other, but it was straight. And that almost has ceased to exist in America. It is all opinion. And you watch what you want to hear, your opinions are coddled and strengthened, you don't listen to anyone else, and it's a nightmare for proper democratic argument. And if we ever get to that position here, I think it'll be extremely dangerous.
I agree with that, but I have one other problem I had with balance. I should tell you this. I was born in the council house in Clydebank, and one of the elections, I went back to where my grandmother's house was and started knocking on doors. I can't even remember which election it was. And we were just vox popping people, you know, asking people, what are you thinking about politics and what are you doing? And I sent the cut story back to, I can't remember why Clydebank was important in this election, but what I do remember is I sent it back to London and I got a phone call from the editor of the programme who said, "You haven't got any Conservatives in it." And I said,
He was out.
"Have you ever been to Clydebank?" So, I mean, they actually came, I think, 5th after the Communists. I think, I'm pretty sure they came 5th after the Communists.
It's a good showing in Clydebank.
Which is, I know, we're still looking for those people.
But I think, I think you're absolutely right about that. I mean, this, the fake balance thing it doesn't make any sense. But impartiality when you hear it or see it, which is, a straightforward, everyone is interrogated. It's not that you get 2 minutes and so someone else has got to get 2 minutes just because they're saying something different. During elections, of course, there are very, very strict rules about this, which GB News don't seem to follow, but that's another issue. That's an issue for Ofcom. No comment about them. But in the normal course of events, of course, people will always complain and say, my guy or my woman didn't get a fair crack at the whip. But, and I know that there's an enormous amount of self-discipline, not to mention self-flagellation that goes on behind the scenes of where we fare with this person, and really care about it, And, of course, if you use a sentence in the English language, it cannot be absolutely neutral in some, chemically free way. It can't be. There's bound to be an angle that you're coming from. But you know the difference between an angle that is very deliberately pointed to do something other than ask the question people want to hear asked and get the information that they deserve to hear. And if you do that consistently over the piece, people will accept that you're trying to do your job properly, even if you sometimes fall down on it. And I do think I think it's still there, and I think it's profoundly worth defending. I also accept your view, and it may come to me, that, there might come a moment where you say, well, I've had enough of that, and I want to let, look at, John Sopel and Emily Maitlis and their newsagent thing, Liz Goodall, or people who, Andrew Marr, a friend of all of ours, who just thought, well, I can go in LBC and I can let it go. Well, that's fine if you choose to do it, but I still think it's really important that there are places where there are, disciplines, I think, that serve the audience very well.
I'm going to ask the audience if they've got some questions in just a minute. Before I do, I want to ask both of you about, given where we are and what we're talking about being Scottish and about being Scottish in the British media and what difference you think that's made to your perspective. Obviously,
absolutely
obviously, there's the Scottish media mafia, of which the three of us, are.
But what have we got in common?
I shouldn't have said that out loud. But I mean, is there? I mean, Gavin, I'll ask you first. Is there something about the perspective that because you are from one country that is part of a bigger country, because you are, it would inherently make you approach, for example, London media as some sort of outsider? It would give you a different perspective. You likewise spent much of your career early on looking at Belfast and Northern Ireland.
It was big help there.
Different perspective there. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I think being a Scot in the BBC is missionary activity, really.
Do you mean the position or the role?
I mean, it's a role of, first of all, this is a United Kingdom, and there are different parts of it, and actually different parts of it, 3 other parts of it, not England, have different ways of having a government in Belfast and so on. So I think that is a different perspective, which we don't always get. And this is not about the BBC. The BBC is pretty rigorous on this, actually. Yeah. People like Jim Naughtie get on their case if they don't. But other places talk about... secondly, if you're in Scotland, most of the things that in your daily life matter to you are actually decided in Scotland. Right. The health service is devolved and so on. And so there's a trade-off between what we think of as the British news. If you're talking about the NHS, for example, you actually have to be slightly careful about what you're talking about, because it has, and in Northern Ireland, they've got different problems and different issues. So I think, for me, it was a great, great advantage. Although I have to say, this is another bit of name-dropping. Al Gore once said to me, the trouble with you English is, and I said, I'm sorry, Mr. Vice President, can I just stop you there?
Absolutely.
And I said, I'm Scottish. And he looked at me and he went, Braveheart, right? The missionary activity's got a long way to go. I did say he's an Australian and we never dress like that, but it was kind of lost on him. But there is a bit of that. And of course, you go to France, it's Angleterre. They don't talk very much about the United Kingdom. They talk about England. So it's something...
Yeah.
Jim, for balance, you've got to tell us now why it's awful being Scottish.
No,
BBC rules, I'm sorry.
It's not awful. I mean, Gavin touches on a really important point, and I think people here almost certainly all recognise it. This has got nothing to do with where you stand. I'm conscious that Alex Salmond's memorial service is happening as we speak. This has nothing to do with where you stand on that question or on the spectrum of, devolution matters as a whole. But it does have to do with an awakening of a proper national consciousness, I think, in the last 50 years, which, obviously some people take to the conclusion of saying that it's time for the British state in some form or another to be dissolved, and others think the reverse, that it's a moment to recognize what the diversity of these islands and these countries is, and they should be reflected in our institutions. But there's been a very profound shift in the way we look at our institutions and how centralized or not they are. And I think it's actually one that has filtered down, much more profoundly than people will acknowledge in day-to-day conversation. I think it feels a very different place now to the one that, when I started work in the 70s. And I think it's therefore inevitable that there's a range of voices from all around the place that come. But I think it's got more to do with a superior Scottish education, clarity in the use of English, all these things. I think there's some very practical reasons for it, actually. But come on, it's chance. And the idea that the idea that Kirsty or Andrew Neil and us are all the same just because, we were educated north of the border is kind of ridiculous. We're actually rather different, very different in some cases. And so I don't know. There's there's a lot of grumbling, but I don't know.
Okay, one more question before I let the audience ask far better ones. Same question to both of you. Who would you rather be holding to account in a TV or radio studio? Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin? Which of those is the most rewarding interview?
Having seen the Vladimir Putin interviews and seen what happens to people who seem to fall out of very high buildings, I think I'd rather have a go at Donald Trump. Actually, I would be fascinated to do an interview with him.
Do you not think it might be maddening because he wouldn't connect with the questions in the way you wanted him to?
I've never...
Perhaps not, but having seen the Putin interview where he began at 600 AD, and an hour later, anyway, they would both be somewhat difficult interviewees.
That was special.
I always think it's somebody, it's the kind of question that comes up in different forms. Who are the people you wish you would have interviewed? And I used to say, when I was doing today, and said, well, Vladimir Putin, Frank Sinatra, and the Pope. Well, Frank Sinatra, he's dead. You'll never get a proper interview with the Pope. Either previous or this. And Putin, but there's no point, because there just wouldn't be any connection.
Well, what about Trump,
But
though?
Trump, I have never seen Trump do an interview of the kind that we would all expect to see a prime minister doing, of whatever color, in this country. There's just no expectation on people's part there, and it's deeply depressing, actually, that somebody like him will ever be interviewed by anything other than a phoning creep. With Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson, who went to Moscow and did stuff about Putin, broadcast back to Fox, which would never have been allowed on any British broadcast, that it would have been regarded as editorially incompetent, offensive, and just embarrassing. But, this was done because, we haven't realized, look how clean the streets are. There's no crime in the tube stations in Moscow. Just don't get me started. So you wouldn't get anywhere with Putin. You might be able to rile Trump, I think. I've only had one conversation with Trump, and I wouldn't call it a conversation. And it was after his first debate with Hillary Clinton on Long Island in 2016. And he actually came out into the kind of melee. And I said, well, how did you think it went? I thought it was a devastating question. And he said, Well, I've just looked at the instant polls. You know, they all do these instant polls. And they're all showing, you know, I aced it. And I thought, okay, well, at least we've heard from Trump. I went back, look, it wasn't just that he was kind of twisting the fact. It was utterly, completely wrong. I mean, it could not have been more wrong. Every poll that was done showed that he, you know, but he just doesn't care. I mean, he just says it. And no,
No, go on. You're among
no,
friends.
no.
You want to go back to America, don't you?
No. Oh, well, 20,
You want to get out again.
20th January is going to be a big day.
Yeah, it is.
John Bolton, who was his national security advisor,
yes.
whom you know,
And
who
die-hard
is
conservative.
die-hard conservative, vigorously, you know, Russia hawk and all the rest of it, wanted to take military action against Iran in the 1990s. It's just about a year ago, I sat down with him for quite a while in Washington, and he said that he thought that if Trump were re-elected, the damage would be to the United States and the Western alliance would be irreparable. That's John Bolton, not me. And he said he didn't think NATO could survive a second Trump term. I'm not sure about that, but you know, they'll probably come to some fudge. But I mean, this is big, big stuff. It really is. And don't forget, he's also said, and said in every speech in the last 2 months of the campaign, that he was proposing to deport 20 million illegal immigrants, many of whom have been in the United States for generations, working, paying taxes, but undocumented. Now, good luck with that, because the governors of Illinois, Massachusetts, New York, California have said they will not cooperate with immigration authorities. What do you then do if you're running the Department of Homeland Security and Trump has said, I want these people out of the country? I mean, this is going to be rough.
Well, this is the point where we see whether the seriously, not literally thing is true or not. Look, do we have any questions from? Do wait until there's some microphones. So just stick up your hand and one will get to you. Gentleman there, yes, there's a microphone on the way.
Yeah, thank you both very much. I've used fiction quite a lot in my work because plenty of fictional writers warned about the return of Putinism. And one obvious example is Tom Clancy's Farewell, which wasn't a novel, it was a prophecy. More power to your elbow, both of you. Thank you. My question is regarding the current international situation, particularly in Europe. Who in the UK elites is getting the message, and who are those who aren't?
Over to you.
Thanks a lot.
That's a difficult question. I mean, my gut feeling is that, I know that people in the security service and the Secret Service and the Ministry of Defense all know about this in great, great detail, and they know a lot about why Putin's initial attack failed and where the money went, and they know about internal ructions within the FSB because some of the money went into their pockets, and I thought it was quite a laugh that at the time, I don't think it's a laugh now, but I thought it was quite a laugh that the money that was supposed to be used to bribe people in positions of power in the Ukraine was stolen from Putin by members of the FSB, some of whom apparently are now in jail. So we have people in positions of influence and power who know quite a lot about what's going on, and I don't know how terrified they are, but I think they're pretty worried.
I think they are pretty worried, and I think I would just say one thing. I mean, we're at a moment where we've just got a new government. I mean, it's just getting its feet under the table after 5 months. We've just had a leadership election in the main opposition party, which is in a state of transition, and that's obvious wherever it ends up going, and is obviously worried about reform and all these things. Now, so in a strange way, we're kind of obsessed by, what is Wes Streeting going to do at the end? How radical is he going to be? Are they going to renationalize the railways? And if so, how? And so we're kind of looking in. But if you're sitting in government around number 10, and the new National Security Advisor appointed by Starmer, Jonathan Powell, who worked for Blair as Chief of Staff, has been around a long time, whose book, incidentally, on the Belfast Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, and how it was achieved by negotiation, is an absolute masterpiece of description of what, hands-on diplomacy of getting out of a hole, which we'd been in for 300 years, broadly speaking, is all about. And you can bet that there are all sorts of people, including him, and I think he's a very impressive man, who will be thinking about all this and what the arrangements for a post-peace conference deal in Ukraine are going to be. But in a curious way, we're so obsessed by the kind of details of, is this government going to be any good or not? It seems to me the only fair answer to that is to say it's too early to tell. We just don't know if in 2 or 3 years whether most people will think this has been a competent government or not. It's impossible to know. Is Starmer going to emerge as a big figure as Prime Minister? Far too early to say that. But I think behind the scenes, as Gavin says, everybody's aware that, the situation across Europe is so unstable politically. The military situation on the Eastern Front, if you like, with Russia, is up for grabs. And the one thing that I think all the people in the security and intelligence apparatus agree on is the idea that Putin is going to say, right, that's it, I'm not going to have any more of this, I've given up, is for the birds. That's
If you ask yourself, how do dictators fall, top reason is you lose a war.
Yes.
So he cannot, this is existential for him.
Yeah. And, the ruble is now effectively frozen as an international currency. Yeah. He's in deep trouble. There are body bags going back to Russia in great numbers. So in one sense, he must be looking for a deal, but he's never going to accept that his mission to reunite, Kiev and Ukraine with the greater Russia was wrong, because he believes it was right.
Yeah, that's true, absolutely. Another question, we had a gentleman there. We'll come to you next time, sir, just here. Yeah.
Oh, hello, thank you. Just to return to a theme that you had earlier, Scots and journalism. There are a hell of a lot. What is it about the Scottish education that produces journalists?
Do you know? I don't know.
No, I have no idea.
There's a long Scottish tradition in Fleet Street. I mean, it's quite true. And going right back, I can't explain it, but it's there.
Robbie Burns said, facts are cheels that win a ding.
Yes.
Maybe that's it. They're things you can't turn over.
There's
we like facts.
And I'm conscious of where I'm saying this. I think there is quite a clannish, I don't use that word pejoratively at all. I think there's quite a clannish instinct. So Scots in London, for example, this week is an evidence of it, hang together. And I know when I was working in Westminster for, quite a few years, they seemed interminable at the time. I mean, there was a lot of Scottish stuff happening, devolution and all the rest of it in the late 70s and into the 80s. But there was a huge gang of us in the press gallery who clung together because we all had we all spoke in the same way, roughly speaking. And we all kind of, had a background. So I think there is a feeling of holding together. And
but there also is or was a healthy Scottish media of its own, which I guess relative to the size of the population create a lot of opportunities.
And I'm afraid it's gone.
That's sort of talent
I'm afraid it's shriveled away in a quite spectacular fashion. But, things do change. It doesn't mean it's over. It just means it's different. But, when I was in the Scotsman, we were selling 95,000. The Herald was selling about 120, roughly speaking. So, between the two of us, it was, up towards 250,000 copies. And the reason that the two papers were so good was that they were in fierce competition. Now, both those papers have changed dramatically. There's still some very good people writing for both of them. But the commitment from the ownership to put money into journalism has greatly shriveled. And I think to the detriment of the public good in Scotland. I would say, speaking as somebody who lives, at least half my life in Edinburgh.
Where's the next question? Yeah, over there, sir.
You've all talked in different ways about the normalisation of lying in public life and a kind of disdain for truth-telling in lots of parts of the world. I'd like to know where you see the origins of that. I know there are lots of theories about this, but I'd love to get your take, all three of you.
Gavin, this is one for you, I think.
Well, I think people have discovered it works. That's part of it.
Yeah.
I mean, people have always told lies, obviously, but particularly in the House of Commons, if you do it there, and we know the penalties and so on. But when there's a media blizzard, and when the media has expanded so much, seems to be much more difficult to hold people account. I think the other thing is, one of the things I noticed and I find very interesting in the research for the book is that some other countries, Finland is a good example, teach media literacy in schools. So who's this person telling me this? Who owns this? They don't teach it to 5-year-olds, but they bring it in very early. What is this person trying to tell me? Is this a fact or is it an opinion? We don't do that. We have literary criticism. We still, but we don't have that. And I think that's something that would work.
I agree with you. I think civics kind of education in a broader sense is a really important thing. I would just say that I'm always slightly skeptical about this business of things being much worse. I think they're much worse in the sense that, Trump discovered in 2016 that demagoguery works, and it is certainly true that if you get away with it, you push it harder. But I've just finished, I don't know how many of you had the same experience, I've just finished Robert Harris's new book, Precipice, which is, it's a I don't think it's his best book. It's a wonderful book, which some of you may know. It's a story of Asquith's affair with Venetia Stanley, who was, whatever she was, 27 or 28 at the time, when he was Prime Minister, through at least the early years of the First World War. And, Asquith was a great sort of liberal figure and dominating Prime Minister, although it's useful, Robert reminds us that he could walk through St. James's Park and no one would recognize him, But he was writing her. It's a tribute, of course, to the postal services in those days, to which it's a kind of tribute. He would write her a letter at 9 o'clock in the morning in Downing Street, and it would get to her in, Belgrave Square or whatever it was, somewhere around here anyway. By 11, she would write back. He would write another one at 3, and it would be delivered to her by 5. There were 3 letters a day.
They were texting.
And shall we go for a drive to Hampstead Heath and all the rest of it. Anyway, but the really interesting thing, and what Robert does brilliantly in the book, he makes up Venetia Stanley's letters, although he's got all the evidence about what she thought and said from diaries and everything. But he makes up her letters. But every line of every letter that Asquith wrote her is from the Asquith papers, and some of which he's had access to from the family that haven't been public before. And it's extraordinary. He's sitting there with Lloyd George and Churchill in 1915, talking about, there's this problem in Gallipoli. Oh, God, the Dardanelles. It's really difficult. And John French says the Western Front has collapsed. He would be writing, in longhand, a love letter of the most tender sort, never physically explicit, but, letting it all hang out emotionally in a cabinet meeting. And Robert's been able to time some of the discussions that they were having to when the letter was written and sent. It's quite amazing. And he was, of course, passing on to her secret telegrams from the front. Not because he wanted to betray our forces, but because he wanted to get it off his chest. So, every time I hear that, Boris Johnson had a party or whatever it is, you think, well, yeah, but there's been some funny stuff before. I just think that it's the volume and the one thing, that somebody told me about the prorogation business that you raised. And everyone says, this is why we need a written constitution. Well, beware of written constitutions, as any American scholar will tell you now, because if you have a Supreme Court which gets so tilted, a written constitution is actually an impediment and not a benefit. And somebody said to me, look, the way the Constitution works, essentially in this country, is that there is a triumvirate of power brokers, the Queen's Private Secretary, the King's Private Secretary now, the Principal Private Secretary, the Prime Minister, and the Cabinet Secretary. And basically they're the guardians of constitutional propriety. And when you get to a thing like prorogation, when there was a rumour that Boris Johnson might call a snap election to get out of his problems, somebody said to me, you know how that would be stopped? I said, no, it's very, very simple. I said, well, I don't see how constitutionally it could be stopped. Oh, yeah. All that would happen would be the Queen's Private Secretary, as the person was then, would ring the Prime Minister's Private Secretary and say, Her Majesty would be embarrassed to have to refuse a dissolution, at which point it wouldn't happen. Now, but it raises the question, I'll just stop on this, and it's the one you get with Trump. What do you do when you get someone who says the rules don't apply to me?
Well, I'm afraid we've got to leave it there. If you
Oh,
want to hear,
that's a nice thought to take away.
If you want a lot more discussion of the Constitution, I could very much recommend Gavin's book, which might answer that question for you. And look, both Jim and Gavin are going to be signing books afterwards. If you wish to buy one of the books, and you should, head down this side because they'll be in that corner there. Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Naughtie and Gavin Esler.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's terrific.
Thank you.
God bless.